You're listening to Leading Up with Udemy. This podcast is your guide to developing your skills as an emerging or seasoned leader. I'm Alan Todd, your host and the Vice President of Leadership Development at Udemy. Together, we can work, lead, and live differently to create a better world. This week, I'm speaking with Stephanie Okamoto, a dynamic leader at ServiceNow, and David Yeager, an acclaimed developmental psychologist who studies motivation. During her 23 years at Microsoft, Steph was instrumental in defining what management excellence looks like. She helped create the leadership framework to grow the skills and abilities of 30,000 leaders across the organization. She currently leads manager excellence at ServiceNow, where she's focused on shaping the future of management. And Dr. David Yeager is the author of a brand new book called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. It's a groundbreaking new approach to leading the next generation. Carol Dweck of the Growth Mindset fame called David's new book one of the most important books of the past decade, and Angela Duckworth of Grit fame called it required reading. He consults with Microsoft, Disney, the World Bank, the White House, and others. I was super excited to have Stephanie Okamoto and David Yeager on the podcast this week. My aha moment was when I realized that motivating people is really about a human-centered approach to leadership. I can't wait for listeners to hear all about what a human-centered approach to leadership looks like and how that motivates young people. The really cool part about all this is that Stephanie applied much of David's research at Microsoft and ServiceNow. Today, we're going to blend theory and practice. Let's see where this goes. Stephanie and David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So honored to be here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Let's start with you, David. Just background. How did the book come about? What inspired you? And how did you get to where we are today?
Yeah, so I'm a developmental psychologist. I focus on young people anywhere between the onset of puberty, which is around 10, to the adoption of an adult-like role in your mid to late 20s. And there have always been a series of puzzles around how to reach and interact with and motivate young people. And every generation, going back to Plato and Aristotle, has complained about the next generation. And we just end up in the same frustrating loops. And I wrote this book to say, well, what if we just didn't have to deal with that anymore? What if we could actually figure out what captures motivation for young people? And I went on a journey of trying to find great leaders in different industries, in management, in retail, in schools, in higher education, at home. And that's how I came across Steph and her great work. And so I wrote about both the theory of motivating the next generation, but also the practice from great leaders and managers like Steph.
Yeah. And David, you also ran a lot of experiments. You're like an experimental machine.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people know my work from the first large-scale evaluations of growth mindset. So 15 years ago, growth mindset was a promising idea, mostly based in laboratory research. The field studies had a total of 50 participants. And over the last 15 years, we've tested growth mindset worldwide in large experiments. And sometimes as short as kids go to the computer, they read an intervention for 25 minutes, and we find that months or years later, their lives are different. They're choosing hard classes. They're having better health. And so we wanted to take a lot of that experimental work that we've done and blend it with the wisdom of practice to try to make it more applicable for managers and leaders.
Yeah, beautiful. So we'll move over to the wisdom of practice. Stephanie, how did you come about? First of all, management excellence is something you've been championing for decades. And then how did you come across David's work and start working together?
It's amazing how when you meet people, you just click, right? And David and I, that was exactly us. And so I was at Microsoft at the time, and I was owning manager excellence approach and strategy, as well as the manager audience of about 30,000 managers at the time. And David had pitched an incredible idea to Satya and Kathleen. I think, David, you were with Carol Dweck at the time pitching it.
Yeah.
A cool idea about how to leverage the conversations that managers have with employees and the words that they choose that led to, I think, to this book around being more of a mentor and a coach to employees and how to help them grow their careers, their aspirations, their skills. And I was paired, because I own Manager Excellence, I was brought into that project. And from that project, David and I met. It just only took one time. And we just like clicked immediately, talking about our approach from being a human-centered type leader and caring about the whole person, and really actually finding joy. I find so much joy out of lifting and elevating especially the early in career folks that have reported to me, because there's so much potential there. And I get no greater joy than seeing them fly after I've been able to help them build their skills and capabilities to wherever they want to grow.
Yeah, that's great. And David does a great job telling that story in the book, and we'll try to unpack some of that here today. So let's move on to the book. David, let's start with a lot of the conventional wisdom. You tried to break it down and basically say there's so many things that are flawed. So let's start with some of the common stereotypes about Gen Z, and where do we get all that wrong today?
Yeah. So if you talk to any manager of young people, it doesn't take long to hear some complaints, right? They're not independent. They wait to be told to do things. They are trying to weasel their way out of work, be as lazy as possible, and still get paid. They're kind of like that. They're overly sensitive, woke, wimpy idiots is the more or less what we hear these days. And like, I get the frustration. If you say things now to young people that used to not cause a problem, and all of a sudden now you're being accused of being an authoritarian monster as a manager, and you really care about doing a good job, it is legitimately frustrating. So I get it. I think that one of the things we get wrong is we are so quick to rush to blame this specific generation. And in fact, what you find if you look at any generational conflict over the centuries is that older people in general are just blaming younger people. And what can often seem like a generational effect is just an age effect. That as we age, we tend to forget what it was like to be younger, what the worries were, what you were insecure about. And then we kind of blame the next generation for being overly sensitive about the kind of thing that we were just as sensitive about when we were their age. Which isn't to say that there aren't differences. Like, obviously, the availability of social media means that young employees' personal lives are on display a lot more than they were before. But what we try to do is say, all right, let's just remember that the human brain didn't like dramatically evolve over the last 5,000 years or even last 100,000 years. It's not that different than it was even before civilization, right? Let alone early civilization. And when we realize that, it's like what the adolescent brain is doing is it's responding to context. It's trying to figure out how to be successful in the social milieu, given the implicit social rules about what grants prestige and status and belonging and acceptance. And you can think of the adolescent brain, which, by the way, is continuing to develop into the mid, sometimes late 20s, as extra responsive to the social rewards and punishments of the environment. And the reason it needs to do that is because culture changes a lot and really fast. Not just young people, but culture. And so you can think of young people as like the R&D engine of the human species. They're out there trying to figure out how to adapt to things that are changing. Whereas older generations are mostly complaining that they have to adapt because they're like, I already did adolescence. I don't want to do this again. Like, you're telling me I got to change all my iTunes passwords? Like, this is the worst. But it's like the fact that society is changing so fast means we need adolescent brains even more to be extra adaptive. And once you realize that, then a lot of behaviors that seem like frustrating flaws of the kind of idiot, immature, selfish brains of young people actually have a reason. And that reason is something we should be listening to and we can learn from. And if we can start learning to work with young people and their brains and hormones rather than being terrified of them or frustrated by them, then our lives would be a lot better. And frankly, so would our society.
So let's talk about working with them. Steph, you've onboarded lots and lots of Gen Z. You've worked with them. You develop. You see the ones that are high performing. What's your take? And we're going to unpack a little later, but let's just talk about sort of the stereotypes. What's your take on the stereotype issue?
You know, it's interesting because a lot of the articles that I read, you know, state or come from a perspective that David just shared. And that hasn't been my experience. And I don't know if I would like to say it's partly me and how I'm approaching it, But my experience has been more around the fact that you can't peanut butter a manager approach to everybody. And so I've always tried to approach people management from the perspective that each person is an individual and they need and they want different things at different times in their lives, at different times in their careers. And so for me, early in career, again, I'll say it again, it's my most favorite generation to lead, because the excitement is there, the passion is there. If you meet them where they're at and you see them and you treat them in a respectful way, that's really what everybody wants, is to be seen and heard and valued and respected. But the reality is this generation wants to work differently than even how I did at their age. And so if you see them as a whole human being and what motivates them, even if they aren't saying the words to you, when you're having conversations with them, you're paying attention to what makes their eyes light up, what challenges them and what excites them, and when have they reached kind of that, the water level of, okay, that's too much. It's just really paying attention as a people manager to each individual human being and seeing what their passions are and doubling down on that to grow those passions within the role that they have now, as well as the role that you can see them in that they might not even be able to see themselves in. So I think it's really about taking the time yourself to go, okay, what are my biases? What are my triggers? What are the things that I own from a self-awareness perspective as a people leader? And then applying that to every single conversation that you have with anybody that reports to you, let alone this new generation and how they want to work. They want meaning in their work. They want to know that their work means something and it maps to the overall company goals and aspirations, and that they are doing work that matters to the company. And so it's important to make sure that they know that they are and what that looks like.
And I'd love to just add something. One thing that shocked me in talking with Steph, absolutely shocked me, is that you could listen to what Steph said and think that it means managers have to just be catering to young people all the time, adapting the job, changing the expectations, maybe even lowering expectations to make work fun and games for them. But the former direct reports I interviewed from Steph all said, oh no, I did my regular job. It's just that I worked so hard at it that it became kind of easy. So then I found extra things that were super hard and so impressive that no one had ever done them before. And then I got promoted super fast. So Steph's language around whole person, meaning, whatever, doesn't mean you take away the tedium and so on. It's more like framing their regular job as super important and as a chance to get promotional velocity and look great in the company. And then say, well, what's something extra you could do to be in the top 5%, the top 10%? And then Steph makes sure that they do that and that they get the credit for it. Steph will never go to the boss and steal all the credit for her young employees. So they do have promotional velocity and they work way harder. I think there's a skepticism among managers to say, I already have my regular job. I'm a direct contributor also. I'm not going to try to design a birthday party worth of jobs for my, employees. Instead, it's they're working hard, but it's meaningful and they want to stay with the job and they're overperforming and they know they're going to get the credit and the reputation for it. And then people are fulfilled, sometimes stressed, but mostly fulfilled.
So, David, I think there's a mindset that I've observed and the research shows that a lot of people have it, and it's different than what you both described. And that is, and David, you describe it as neurobiological incompetence. I want you to talk about that, but I wanted to frame it as pretty bad results from Gallup's latest studies. They've been studying forever with employee engagement, and particularly with Millennial and Gen Z, the least engaged and moving in the wrong direction. And so they also say in other research that one's relationship with one's manager is the biggest lever in employee engagement. So I can only conclude that managers aren't doing a great job with the things, Steph, that you said, the whole person and respect and dignity. But David, I want to start with you. What is this mindset of neurological incompetence? You cover it really well in the first couple chapters. And I think why it's important is because you've convinced me that it's like deep-seated in us, and then a lot of our actions and behaviors, they manifest from this thing. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, there's an idea going back to ancient Greek philosophy that the planning and thinking regions of the brain are underdeveloped in youth, especially adolescence, and that the emotional impulsive regions are hyperactive, and they tend to take over. They hijack the brain so that we can't reason logically. And that what it means to grow up is to, over time, allow the logical parts of the brain to control and suppress the emotional parts of the brain. And neuroscience took that idea and ran with it in the 90s and 2000s. And they had a good use for that. The main use for it was to try to argue that juveniles who committed serious crimes shouldn't be put away for life. Basically saying it's a crime of passion, and therefore you shouldn't do death penalty for 16-year-olds. And that's a valuable argument. But what happened is then we kind of took this cultural idea that the young person's brain is incapable of logical reasoning and thinking about the future. And then we added a layer of brain imaging to it that made it feel permanent and universally true and inarguable. So what you saw was this permeation of the idea, even doctors saying, well, we can't expect people to take their medicine because that's like asking someone without triceps to do push-ups because they just lack a prefrontal cortex, right? And I think that spilled over into management. Is that, just take the retail example, you see a manager who's got a bunch of 19-year-olds who it seems like their main motivation is to go sneak in the back and smoke weed and try to take naps so they don't have to like clean up the aisle or unpack the boxes, right? And then you saw this in the pandemic, right, with managers saying, you can go pretend to work somewhere else, implying that young people are just goofing off all day, cheating their bosses out of work, pretending to work, et cetera. And I think that the natural consequence of attributing frustrating young employee behavior to a biological incompetence is to say you need more and more threats and punishments and safeguards and/or more and more bribes, because you can't rely on the self-control and agency of young people because it's underdeveloped. So that leads to lots of, nanny cams and nanny software tracking employees, like mandates to do this or that, things that come across as really super duper controlling, but feel essential to bosses because they think they're being cheated out of hours from their FTEs. And so what I think is that's like going to start an arms race where basically young people are going to rebel more and more because they feel more and more disrespected by all the kind of authoritarian state surveillance, and or the top employees will just go somewhere else where they can feel accepted and cared for and feel joy in their work, and they just won't put up with it. So the companies that go farther and farther down that race will pay more and more for more and more mediocre talent. And my hypothesis starting out was, well, what if we had a different view of the adolescent brain? What if we thought of it as something that's just more sensitive to different kinds of experiences, specifically experiences like status, prestige, positive reputation, meaning, purpose, contribution. And it really matters to them that they have those things and that they can tell themselves a story about it. And what I found again and again, and I write about it in the book, is workplaces where young people were independent. They weren't kind of trying to cheat their bosses out of hours of work. They communicated proactively if something came up. They were dependable and reliable because they cared about doing things right, but they also cared about their reputations as people who were good contributors and had promotional velocity. And I think that appealing to that deeper sense of meaning and purpose, well, of course, making sure people are compensated well, is an alternative strategy.
So, Steph, what's a mentor mindset for you? And give me a tip, something we can try.
It's about listening. It's really about empathetic listening. You need to listen more than you speak. And I think a lot of times if you're just listening, then, whatever the topic is, right? Listening with a kind ear and then offering something that's helpful, not going, the one thing I hate is when it's the one up. Like, I know, I've been there, I've done this or whatever. It's good to share your experience and what you've learned from it, but it's also something really special to be able to just listen and pay attention to how the person is speaking, what they're saying, the words they are choosing, and almost helping them kind of figure it out on their own through conversation and through listening versus I'm now going to tell you the answer to your problem. That's the first thing. And just knowing, again, everybody has a story.
You have a real curiosity.
Yes.
You've got a real curiosity for what the young person is saying.
Yeah.
That's rare.
And ask, don't tell. There was a lot of that in the book about questioning, really good stuff. Okay, lightning question. If we look at the research, we know there's an amazing amount of stress and anxiety in young people. And if we're starting to practice high performance with high support, we know that there's going to be some stress. So Stephanie, tell me, how do you help people cope with the inevitable stress that arises from doing all this? I want to hear how you think about stress in the workplace, whether it's George Floyd social unrest, it's a pandemic, it's work from home, it's you've got high standards, no matter what hybrid work, we still got to get everything done. And I'm freaking out and pulling my hair out. What do you do?
First and foremost, the thing that I do is I have the conversation, right? I feel like the one thing managers tend to do the most is they avoid. That's going to be too hard, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to do the wrong thing, or I'm uncomfortable, so I'm going to avoid it. And the reality is what you need to do is have the courage to lean in and start the conversation. You might not get it right, but it's better than not saying anything at all. And so I think that would be something that I know a lot of companies, a lot of managers and leaders struggle with. And, we're working on at ServiceNow right now, just in enabling managers to have the courage to have the conversations that are not easy or the ones they usually want to avoid, and then listen.
That's great. Having the courage to step up and do it. All right, David, stress that arises now. What do we do?
Yeah, so the enforcer way of dealing with stress is saying, this is what I'm paying you for, so you need to suck it up and deal with it.
Suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah, it's like, that's your compensation. That's the kind of baby boomer mentality, is like, you're not supposed to like your job. You're supposed to like how you spend the money you earned from your job. And the protector is, oh my God, you're a snowflake. We have to remove all your responsibilities. But that doesn't help a 23-year-old who's trying to make their reputation. Can you imagine if like every junior lawyer was told that? They would never make partner. Every McKinsey consultant. So removing all responsibilities, I don't think is right either. In the mentor mindset, the idea is maintain very high expectations, but see what supports you can add. And then on top of that, reframe the stress as a resource for doing well. So you can say things like, this is really stressful. It's stressful because we've chosen to do something that nobody else is doing. And we're going to make sure you get credit for having done this very impressive thing that was very stressful. But while you're doing it, that like racing heart, like sweaty palms before you give a presentation to a client, that's your body kicking in. Those are resources to help you perform better. And we found in experiments that's actually true, that when people hear that, their stress physiology is literally better, and so is their performance.
To the point of that, David, I've switched my own mindset in that, and I've shared it with others in that be excited nervous, not scared nervous. Be excited. Like I've had to tell myself, Steph, they're going to want to hear what you have to say. Don't be afraid. Don't leave the room or the meeting or the conversation without saying anything. Be excited to share your knowledge and your empathy and your approach. And so instead of being scared, you flip it to say, be excited instead.
Yeah. Of all the things I researched, that's the number one thing I use on my kids. Like they go up to bat. It's like, be excited to hit. That racing heart, that's you being excited to get in there and face a good pitcher.
I do the same thing with my kids. Yep. And myself.
Final question that we ask everybody, and that is, what are you curious about and learning now?
Well, as I look around me with all my stacks and stacks of books, I'm curious about a lot of things. The one thing that is top of mind, I'll tell you, for me right now that I am curious about and leaning in and reading a lot about is civility in the workplace. I believe that right now, the state of the world, there's a lot of different elections going on. We in the United States, we're going into a really volatile time right now. And like I mentioned earlier, the blur between personal and professional is more blurred than ever since COVID, right? And these conversations are going to happen. And how do you approach it? Do you approach it head on? Do you wait for them to come up and then deal with it? And my perspective on that is you just need to be ready regardless that these things are going to happen. And how do you keep authenticity and vulnerability and empathy in the workplace? Because it's so important, but at the same time, ensure that there is this civility among each other, that we can keep respect and kindness forefront. That's what I've been reading a lot about.
Beautiful. I love it. David, over to you. What are you curious about in learning now?
I'm very interested in pathways into the workforce that might not go through traditional post-secondary. So you think of 70% of Americans are unlikely to have a 4-year college degree. What futures are we creating for them? And if all their workplaces are ones where they're looked down on and treated, as though they're nothing, with no trajectory, no place to go, constant surveillance, why are they going to believe that our society is fair? And how are they going to believe that their skills matter? And why should they grow? And why should they be curious? And I think manager excellence, that's going to affect that 70% of America, increasingly young men who are not going to college. That's super interesting. So grocery stores, restaurants, just like retail. So if any listeners want to live in a world in which you can have a respectful, human-forward managerial relationship that pushes you to be independent and autonomous and a major contributor, even if you don't have a college degree. I want to live in that world, and anyone else who wants to work on that, I'd love to hear from them.
If I can I just piggyback on that for 1 second? I know it was the last question.
Please.
But to that point, David, I think that's where, there's so much talk about AI and taking jobs and what is it going to look like, and so much kind of angst and excitement both at the same time, polarizing that conversation. The one thing remains true, that AI, I think from a people manager perspective, will do amazing things to lift process type things off of the plates of managers, to then be able to leave the room and space for managers to be able to focus on what machines and AI cannot do. And that is that human piece, that caring, empathetic human piece where you are growing other human beings.
Right. Relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks again to Stephanie Okamoto and David Yeager for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Follow Leading Up, a podcast from Udemy Business, wherever you find your podcasts. We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode to help you level up your leadership skills. Follow the show so you never miss an episode. And if you like the show, leave a rating or a review. We'd love the feedback, and it really helps us to find new listeners. To learn more about Leading Up or how Udemy can help you develop leaders at scale and move business forward, visit business.udemy.com. The Leading Up podcast is produced in partnership with Pod People. Our original theme is by Soundboard.